On the previous episode of the K-swapped FD build, I brought my FD from Virginia to Plover, Wisconsin to have Andy work on the swap. We tore everything down to get a good baseline to start with and ensure we had everything put together right. And it's a good thing we did, because Andy immediately found that the wrong flywheel bolts were being used. We stripped down the long block and cleaned it up with some fresh new spark plugs and gaskets. The oil pan that was on the motor was cracked, so we replaced it with a stronger steel pan that was baffled by Unit 2 fabrication. I sanded down the custom engine cradle and painted it black to ensure it wouldn't rust. The motor was now ready to go back in the car. The transmission differential brace needed to be slightly modified to bolt up the rear diff. We then finished connecting the rest of the drivetrain. I went to Fortunato's headquarters to get some special 510 coilovers built for the car, and we got the car back on the ground.
Got the steering rack bolted back in, and the steering rack was hitting the oil pan. It was a close fit before, but I think the new oil pan, it was just hitting the lip. I tried to notch out part of the oil pan to make some clearance, but it still looked way too tight. So we ended up actually modifying the subframe. We just cut the front of the subframe where the rack sits on and actually just moved it forward probably 1/8 or 1/4 of an inch. It wasn't much. So we just simply cut this front section where the steering rack bolts on. We just cut that and moved it forward probably about 1 centimeter, just a little bit, to make a little more clearance between the engine and the steering rack, and hopefully not alter the geometry and stuff too much. But yeah, so we cut it, welded it back up, painted it.
Moving the steering rack can be dangerous to the suspension geometry of the car. Thankfully, we took all measurements into account, and considering the lower ride height of the car, this steering rack position should actually help the steering toe angle.
I think this is gonna, yeah, I think this is gonna drive better than an RX-7.
Ooh! You said it's gonna drive better than an RX-7.
There's all kinds of different motors we could have put in here, from LS to 2J, RB, you know, whatever. The reason this engine I think suits this chassis a little bit better, especially for the power goals that Ben has here, it doesn't screw up the weight balance. In fact, I think it's even a little bit lighter than the rotary engine. And it also doesn't cause the steering rack to have to be moved really far forward, which changes, you know, obviously the steering and geometry and everything. So yeah, I think it's the perfect engine for this application. Hold on, do it again.
With this build, there's a lot of thinking ahead. We need to make sure we order all the proper fittings and AN line that we're going to need to make the turbo work. I have some of it in parts bins, but definitely not all of it. And per usual, I want to make sure that I have the best stuff possible. There's also some factory items that I need to get, which we can thankfully order from Advanced Auto Parts and have them delivered to the shop. That's another benefit of the K-Series motor, is that parts are easier to get than rotaries.
If only it were that easy.
I think that bolt's there.
Yeah, that's perfect. That's perfect. Fire it up.
While we were messing with the steering rack, we noticed the tie rod ends were worn out, so we got some new replacements for that as well. Next, we have a new water pump and alternator. You know me, you know I like to have everything fresh on the motor so I don't have to worry about it. All new gaskets and all new bolts, which sounds like a lot easier than it actually is. I probably used hundreds of brand new bolts, and every few minutes I would hear,
"All right, now we need some more bolts."
Eventually, all the engine accessories were installed.
Yeah, from there I think, we had to bleed all the brake lines, which they ran all new brake lines everywhere. So I was actually expecting to find a leak or two, maybe they didn't do the flares correctly or something, but they actually did a really good job there. We just tightened up all the lines and bled it, then the brakes actually feel great. It took a bit to bleed the clutch. The master, the cylinder inside there was kind of, since this car probably hasn't ran for 10 years, someone pushed the clutch in and then that's where it sat. So the master was a little sticky. I had to actually pull it out and kind of, tap it a bit to get the cylinder inside the master to move around a bit. But There's so many things in this motor with a motor swap that take a lot of time, and we kind of got a little head start having some of this stuff already done for us from the previous owner. Some of it a few steps backwards. You know, some of it was done, but some of it we had to redo. We found quite a few little issues, but tackle them as they come.
As we got deeper and deeper into the project, we kept finding setbacks. The next issue is with the turbo manifold. It's been custom fabricated, and it looks like the threads have been messed up at some point along the way.
I mean, this is a tap. It'll tap new threads, but the threads are already there. They were just damaged, so we're rerunning it through so that the bolt will go in.
A very minor issue, but once we had the manifold out of the car, we noticed a much larger issue.
We've noticed when we set the turbo on the manifold, it had a little teeter to it. So when they welded the flange on that manifold, they must not have had it bolted down to anything because it warped that flange. So we're gonna have a local guy that does a lot of work for me. He's gonna re-flatten that for us.
Is Big Irv, giving Andy Smedegard a hand with Ben's new FD project. They ran into a little bit of trouble here with the project that he bought. Of course, you run into problems with projects you buy from somebody else, and mounting flange here is a little warped. So we're gonna take a cleanup cut on the milling machine, and then we'll probably do a little bit of lapping on the granite service table. So let's get to it, and we'll get it fixed and get it back over so they can get it put on the car. The granite table is super flat. This is what's used as an inspection table for making parts, possibly lapping it with paper, adhesive paper to the table. We decided also to check the exhaust manifold flange, and we're noticing it was warped too, so we're doing a little bit of lapping on that. You can see here where we're starting to take some off here, we're starting to take some off there, but we got some real heavy low spots right there, so we're just going to keep lapping this. So we're deburring this so that Andy doesn't cut his delicate little hands on machined parts. So I was able to take a cleanup cut on the milling machine.
Okay.
And then I lapped it a little bit and then deburred it.
Perfect. Which just typically happens mostly from when they weld all this stuff. All that heat will distort the metal and cause it to warp. Usually what you should be doing is this should be bolted down to some sort of jig, and then they weld with that bolted down, and that will hold that nice and flat, but that obviously didn't happen in this case. When we went to bolt the turbo up, it like was rocking and teetering back on there. You could see a pretty big gap through there, so that would have caused a pretty big exhaust leak. So Irv here got us all fixed up, and we should be good to go.
This engine bay is starting to look proper with that turbo sitting next to the K20, but we're still not even halfway through this build yet.
I am removing the fuel pump to put a bigger fuel pump in, like you do with most builds that are going to make more than stock power.
Ooh, look at that. Wow, actually that's a lot bigger than I expected.
The factory fuel system is not going to push enough fuel for my K-series. I'm using a Walboro 255 fuel pump for this, which should be good enough for the power I'm going to make while keeping the sound quiet. I'm also putting in a fuel tank baffle because FDs are known for fuel starving around corners. The fuel tank is a 20-gallon tank, so there's a lot of room for sloshing. The baffle sits on top of the fuel pump basket and keeps the fuel closer to the pickup on the pump.
So we've got the baffle in there, mostly. I've got 7 new cuts on my hand from all the sharp metal in there.
It was quite frustrating to work inside the fuel tank, but hopefully it's worth it. As I got the new fuel pump and baffle installed, Andy was working on putting in new axles. The axles that came with the car were already torn, but surprisingly, new axles for this car are pretty cheap, and they're the same for both sides. As for the brakes, I'm going to keep the stock system, but we'll refresh it with some rotors and pads. Since this car is mostly being built for street, I don't need anything crazy for braking.
We just got some axles in and we got brake rotors and brake pads. So just making this car more and more new every day.
Awesome. So you're all good to go.
Great, thank you. I ordered a special part. I bought this used from a couple guys named Dave and Pete. You might have heard of them from Speed Academy. Packing material. I got their fuel rail from their K-Swap 240. K-Swap guys stick together. We got more parts. Running Injector Dynamics 1050X injectors. Got these from Art of Attack, and if you haven't heard of Art of Attack, they carry everything known under the sun for Hondas, including these injectors that are for S2000s. So I'm going to run the 1050X injectors because they are good with flex fuel, which is why I got a flex fuel sensor also from Art of Attack. Woo!
This is actually a fuel rail for an S2000 because we are using an S2000 intake manifold. Get these injectors in. I'll have to repin some new connectors on here for these new injectors.
Before we continue, I realized that I had forgotten to paint the bare metal patch on the Firewall. The Firewall was notched back about 2 inches to clear the top of the K-Series, and I need to paint it to make sure it doesn't rust.
We will paint the whole car eventually, which means taking the engine and everything out. Cleaning up the engine bay. We'll probably, clean up some of these welds, make them look a little smoother. But for the time being, I want to make sure it doesn't rust, because this body is actually in really good shape, very rust-free chassis, and I want to keep it that way.
Of course, I needed to make another run to Advanced Auto to get some paint. And more bolts. I always need more bolts. The car color is a very rare color shift color called Montego Blue. I'm going to do my best to paint match it, but I'm not too worried about it since I will eventually paint the whole car inside and out. I laid down a black base coat and then topped it off with a light green color. It actually turned out pretty good. At least it won't rust now. But what's going to clean up this engine bay even more is the new valve cover that just arrived from K-Tune.
Very clean, very stealth. Oh yeah, that's nice. Heck yeah, that's gonna look really good.
The K-Tune valve covers look good, but they also provide AN fittings on the side to run to a catch can, which we'll probably do in the future. The engine looks complete now, even though it's not. There's no wiring harness, fuel lines, vacuum lines, throttle cable, intercooler piping, and so much more. But we're so eager to get this engine started.
Honestly, we're getting down to this last step of just wiring, and then I can fire.
At this point, all the final steps for the engine are very basic and tedious items. The biggest thing remaining is going to be the custom wiring harness. But we don't need a wiring harness to just turn the engine over. We want to hear the engine crank in case there's any internal issues that we'll want to address before spending more time doing the wiring. The only thing left to do before manually cranking the engine over is fluids. The engine cranks over nicely and we can hear compression and see oil pressure. I ran the car through all of the gears on the starter motor to make sure the transmission and drivetrain were good, and it looks like everything is working out. So now it's time for the wiring.
All right, today is day 5 or 6, and we're gonna start tackling the wiring, specifically the engine harness. And we are using a K-tuned tucked engine harness, which is saving us a ton of time because it's all wired as far as the plugs going to all the sensors, the coils, the injectors, everything. We are using an AEM Infinity ECU. So this harness, engine harness that we have is wired up currently for just a PRB ECU, just a Honda ECU. Since we're using the Infinity, all we need to do is basically cut off the ECU connector and we're gonna wire it right into our AEM Infinity. And we will also be using the AEM Flying Lead power harness. So basically with these two harnesses, we're gonna merge them together and get it all connected up to the AEM Infinity.
I decided to go with a standalone ECU because Andy is very familiar with them, and it should save us some time. Converting the harness over to the AEM Infinity didn't take too long. They make plug-and-play adapters for this sort of thing, but like a lot of other things on this build, those adapters are on back order for months. If you ever wonder why I didn't get a certain part, it's probably because it's not in stock anywhere. I kept running into this issue, but thankfully Andy is crafty and can make this work without a problem, and it ended up with a cleaner result in the end. There's no body harness in the car, but that's an issue that we'll tackle later. Right now, we want to get this engine fired up, which means we need to finish plumbing up the fuel system and then hook up the new engine harness. We don't have a tune loaded into the ECU, obviously, but Andy loads up a close map to see if we can get this engine to run. I know it doesn't sound healthy, but that's just because the engine isn't tuned yet. This confirms that the engine is good, and we got the car to fire up. It's all smooth sailing from here. That is, until we found our next issue. There's a coolant leak somewhere. Andy pressurized the system and we can hear it hissing. But it still took us a while to find because it's in the most unlikely place.
We'd have to redo some of our cooling lines.
It's all these little cracks all over the place.
It's coming out where they grinded away part of this intake manifold where the EGR stuff sits. They grinded it away, but they must have got it too thin because there's like hairline cracks.
We're using an S2000 intake manifold with the coolant stuff still attached, and we got it all in the car, and we're pressurizing the cooling system, and we hear little leaks. We noticed some cracks, little hairline cracks on the intake manifold where they must have cut it really close, and it kind of looks like they maybe even tried to weld the holes back up. So we ended up actually just lopping off that coolant part of the intake manifold. And using a billet coolant housing that goes on the PRB cylinder head. And now the intake manifold is completely just intake manifold. There's no coolant running through the intake manifold at all.
Kind of lucky, I completely forgot I had it.
Alright, so I've successfully ground off this side of the intake manifold to clear the new coolant housing that we have, so that's nice. So we have a separate intake manifold, but on the other side, it was previously ground down here too far. And there was actually, I could see light coming through, so it wasn't thick enough. And this is an air passage side, so we would have gotten a pretty severe boost leak and vacuum leak out of that. So Andy just welded on an extra plate of aluminum on top of that. So this is very thick there right now. So I'll probably grind it down a little bit and smooth it down. But it's a lot thicker there now, and shouldn't have any more boost leaks. And hopefully we don't find any more problems that the previous owner has caused us. Which, so far it's caused an issue with the exhaust manifold wasn't level. The intake manifold was too ground down on this side. The subframe wasn't positioned correctly for the steering rack. The flywheel bolts were incorrect. So this is what you get when you buy somebody else's project. I mean, you're gonna run into stuff like this that they've overlooked. What have we overlooked? Nothing, because Andy's working on it. Unfortunately, today is our last day here at Andy's shop, and the car is still far from done. It's running, and we've gotten most of the difficult work done, but this car is being built as a street car, which means that I want all of the amenities in it. Air conditioning, power steering, cruise control, and without a body harness in the car, it's still a project that's a long way from being completed.
All right, well, as you can see, we've rolled the FD outside of the shop because we wanted some fresh air.
Yeah, get a little cooped up in there.
Yeah, but it runs, so that's good. It doesn't drive yet.
Yeah, we've got most of the wiring done. We've got to complete a little bit of wiring on the inside, kind of get the battery secured. It's honestly not that far away from probably being like drivable down the road. But we had a few snags with the cooling system and the intake manifold and stuff, so that's what we addressed today and kind of got that all buttoned up. Probably another few hours, I bet we could get this thing drivable.
Unfortunately, I have to leave to go film Grid Life, so I'm gonna leave the FD here in the insanely capable hands of Andy.
Yeah, so I'll get a little bit more time to kind of go through a few things. I know we want like AC stuff working. We want to make a new downpipe that gives us a little more clearance for some of the coolant lines and stuff. So yeah, that's probably what I'll be tackling, kind of get to take my time on it a little bit.
I was worried about leaving it here because I wanted to film it for you guys so that you could actually see the whole process, but honestly, most of the visual stuff has been done. Everything else, like he's gonna be splicing wires for like 15 hours. I don't know how much you wanna see that. Andy's gonna do his best to film with his phone.
I'm gonna go pick up a new iPhone, what is it, 11? Is that the latest one now?
It'll be documented. You'll see everything happening. So, and you said you're gonna paint the engine bay and the whole car and everything?
Yeah, I'll paint it. Yeah, there's some spray cans up in.
Yeah, so that's where we're leaving it for here, and I hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll see you in the next one. It might not be released right after this, like we've done in the past. There might be a little bit of time.
Cool. You want to drive? I'll push you in.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, I'll drive.
Hop in.
Sweet.
I got the back.
All right. One Andy power is a lot.
Pit stop.